Well, speaking of fossil fuel makes me remember that you have done some work with energy and agriculture, and I wanted to ask you about that.
Yes, in fact, that was the reason we first got into organic farming studies. The National Science Foundation in the 1970s was supporting agricultural research that was, in a sense, well ahead of its time. It was sort of like the LISA program, but 15 years earlier, in which they were supporting research that had a particular orientation towards environmental preservation, food quality, resource conservation, and so forth.
When was this? Excuse me.
In the 1970s.
Okay.
So in 1973, people were jolted by the energy embargo and the price increases for oil.
Yes.
And people suddenly realized, uh-oh, our food system uses that stuff too. We better look at this. So the National Science Foundation supported several projects involving energy use in agriculture. The one that I was involved in Washington University, St. Louis, was one of those. The reason we got into organic farming first was that we knew that artificial fertilizers are one of the main uses, fossil fuel demands of the American agricultural system, and we had heard about these farmers, these shadowy types called organic farmers, who apparently were doing reasonably well without using synthetic fertilizers, so there was the possibility for serious energy conservation there. So the energy aspect of organic farming was the first thing that got us into it. Once we were studying these farms, however, we didn't stop at merely comparing their energy requirements to those of conventional farms. That would be really too limited. We looked at a whole bunch of things like yields and soil erosion and grain quality and so forth. I mean, it doesn't make sense to compare two systems only on the basis of their energy requirements. That's one of the things, but it certainly does not exhaust the list.
No. Willie, you're too practical a person to advocate all the farmers in the world turning into organic farmers. I assume that you don't envision this happening. What do you envision, though, for energy sources for us in the future?
Well, the best energy source is not to need it in the first place. I mean, conservation clearly is the first thing to do, and a lot of farmers have done that. They were pretty startled by what happened to the price of fuel in the 70s, and there were many ways of cutting down on your fuel requirements, some of them easy, and those have mostly been done, some of them not so easy. So conservation first, things like keeping your tractor in better tune, for example. I mean, farmers did that, that's the easy stuff. But you can't completely eliminate some kind of external energy source. Agriculture is well set up to take advantage of the sun. You know, it already is mainly driven by the sun, despite the fact that we talk about the fossil fuel intensiveness of agriculture, which is true. The single biggest energy input into agriculture is the sun. And there are ways of making better use of the sun. Agriculture needs fuel for some things that are not so easy to do by solar, but some things are much easier, like, for example, keeping animal houses warm in the winter is very suitable for solar. Solar is very suitable for heating water, let's say for a dairy barn. Solar can also be used to run irrigation pumps. Windmills are a kind of solar energy, and you know, once upon a time they were very popular on American farms, and there's been some interest in bringing them back in a more modern, high-tech form, of course. The agriculture can also produce fuels from waste materials. Biogas, for example, from dairy manure had a wave of popularity in the 70s, and then when oil prices went down, interest kind of subsided. That's kind of unfortunate. It seems that our interest in energy sources for agriculture goes up and down with the price of oil, which means it can come and go in 1 or 2 years, and it has come and gone several times since the 70s. I would prefer to see a long-range commitment to freeing agriculture from dependence on fossil fuel. It might take several decades to do it, but if the interest goes away every time there happens to be a surplus of oil, we'll never get there. And so, unfortunately, we have not made as much progress as we might have.
Do you see any future for ethanol?
Yes, I think ethanol was oversold in the 70s. It became a kind of a missionary cause. People were really, they were selling it off the back of the wagon patent medicines at the carnival, and it was oversold. It was the cure-all for farmers, and they harmed themselves, as people always do when they do that sort of thing. And so it got a bad press, and justifiably so. But I can see a modest role. It's not the solution, but you don't need one solution. If a whole bunch of different alternative energy sources each contribute their 5 or 10 or 15% or whatever, that could get the job done. So I don't see ethanol as a cure-all, but I see it as having a modest but not trivial place in a broader energy program.
Do you see hope for different kinds of crops being introduced? I know you have written extensively about the introduction of the soybean, something which interested me greatly because I can remember my father starting to grow soybeans.
When was that?
Probably in the 40s. And it was a very controversial and risky thing in southern Illinois, where the farm is.
And it paid off handsomely,
Oh,
however.
it still does, relatively speaking.
Well, the reason I started looking at the soybean a little is because I was struck by the fact that we seem to be remarkably rigid as far as what we do or do not grow in American agriculture. We actually grow very few crops compared to the number that are out there somewhere that might be grown. And there's somehow the idea that this is the way it has to be. Well, that idea was questioned in the 70s and especially in the 80s because of energy problems and because of surpluses of corn and so forth. People got more of an interest in possibly raising alternative crops. But it's been a very long time since we introduced an alternative crop successfully. Sunflower actually had some success in the 70s, pretty new for us. I'm talking now about oilseed sunflower, not for birdseed or candy. Amaranth has gotten some an appreciable amount of attention, but by and large we seem to stick with the ones we already have, and we don't really have experience in major introduction of new crops, yet people are looking for alternatives, as well they should. So I spent a little time looking at the history of the soybean to see how that happened, and it really can be quite an inspiration. I mean, the soybean went from a negligible crop to a major cash crop, a major export crop, in about 2 or 3 decades, and that's pretty good. So I think people should be a little more open to the idea of an overhaul of what we grow. I think back in the 1920s, if you had said to people that someday the soybean will be the most valuable crop in U.S. agriculture, there were a few people who would have just loved to hear what you were saying, but most people would have looked at you as though you were some kind of weirdo or something.
Yes.
What kind of nut is this?
Well, I was impressed with what you wrote about the necessity for various industries or aspects of the production of soybeans to be working together. It all had to come together like the legs on the table analogy.
That's right. It was partially done by USDA. USDA took a major leadership role in promoting the soybean. So did several of the state experiment stations. I guess the states and USDA still cooperate a little.
Yes.
And private industry got involved pretty early. Seed companies had to be involved. Oil seed processors had to be involved because you can grow the stuff, but if nobody's willing to buy it and process it, you might as well not grow it. And yet, the processors were not willing to commit facilities unless they knew that the growers would be raising this stuff. So it had to be done in its entirety, and it was exemplary that they could get this kind of coordination. We talk a lot about coordination of that sort today, but I think if that kind of thing were going on now, it would be made proprietary right away. As soon as somebody realized there's some big bucks here, I think they would they would clamp down on it. The early soybean promoters were notable in their sharing of breeding materials, sharing of information between private and public, between different branches of public agencies, and so forth. And that's how you get progress. I'm not so sure that we would I think the lawyers would be in on it, and the patent attorneys would be in on it right away, and you could kiss it goodbye. And
you made the point, I believe, that that was true in this country, but it was not true in England?
So I have read. I don't have first-hand knowledge of it, but I have read that in England it was kept, they played it very close, and they did not share this kind of They did not have this cooperative attitude, and from what I have read, that meant that the soybean never took off in England, although there was interest in it. Another thing that we had in those days, and we don't necessarily have today, is we had a few individuals who had a very, very intense personal commitment to it and who stuck with it for a long time. Nowadays, it seems everyone wants the quick payoff. You know, you want results next year or 2 years from now. Well, the legwork and or I should say, you know, the foundation work that preceded the commercialization of soybean took a lot of patience. It took a lot of dedication. The plant breeding, the explorations to China and Japan and Korea to bring back varieties, and the testing and all of that stuff. It took people who are willing to stick with it for several decades and who were willing to put their personal reputations behind it. But unlike the ethanol promoters that I was talking about, these were all people whose science was very good. They were respected as agronomists and breeders and so forth, but they also had a personal commitment. They not a monetary commitment. These were mostly publicly paid scientists, I should say. And I think these days, I'm not sure that people would be willing to stick with such a thing in the long haul the way, but if you don't get it right, and you risk, you know, that the thing you're trying to promote gets a bad press and people reject it, even though it may have had merit.
You don't see people with vision, which is what I think you're describing, working in the fields today?
No, I wouldn't say that. It's not a question of vision. I think many people concerned with alternative agriculture and sustainable agriculture could certainly be said to have vision. But you have to back up that vision with, you have to be in a position to be allowed to work on something for a very long time. The institutional circumstances, the money, the support, and all that has to be there. And so it's not a question of people lacking vision. It's a question of we seem to do things differently these days, and that we seem to reward the short-term project, and people who want to back up their vision with a long-term involvement in some area, it's just not so easy to do so anymore.